welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a really fascinating case study out of Ohio. It asks a pretty critical question. What happens when a political fortress, one that seemed totally loyal to Donald Trump, starts to show cracks? We're going to explore those subtle signals that pop up when a power structure you thought was invincible starts to decay from the inside out. So this story, it doesn't really start with some big explosion. It's more of a quiet, behind-the-scenes kind of thing. It's that moment when people stop just buying into the performance and start doing the math on what it's actually costing them in their own lives. You see, Ohio was supposed to be this political fortress for Donald Trump, a state he had totally locked down. But instead, it turned into this kind of pressure chamber, and it exposed the limits of a power strategy that's built on spectacle and personality. It's really a warning flare for what can happen when that kind of power just pushes a little too far. Okay, so to really get what's going on here, we have to talk about this core idea: power decay. This isn't about loud opposition or people protesting in the streets. No, it's way quieter and, honestly, way more fundamental. It's about the withdrawal of belief. And once that happens, the old tools, they just stop working. So that brings us to the big question driving this whole analysis, right? Why Ohio? And why now? What was it about the conditions on the ground there that made it the place where the cracks in Donald Trump's power structure first became so obvious? So the analysis points to a few key mistakes, and it frames them using Robert Greene's famous 48 Laws of Power. The idea is that these alleged missteps started to chip away at the very foundation of Donald Trump's support in the state. All right, so the first big mistake identified here: isolation. I mean, think about it. As this slide shows, power starts to rot when it gets cut off from what people are actually going through. You start misreading the very room you think you own. And then there was this huge assumption that loyalty would just trump everything, even people's own self-interest. You know, when those tariffs hit and soybean sales just collapsed, that wasn't some abstract trade war for an Ohio farmer. That was money right out of their pocket. Demanding sacrifice without a real reward, that's a deadly miscalculation. And this is where a key strategy just completely backfired. See, getting everyone's attention is great when it makes you look powerful, but when you pair that spectacle with actual suffering, people seeing leaders living in luxury while their own communities are struggling, well, that attention just speeds up the decay instead of building power. So at the end of the day, that whole performance of power, act like a king and you'll be treated like one, it only works as long as the audience believes you've earned it. The second that crown starts looking like cheap costume jewelry, the spell is just broken. Okay, so these weren't just tactical mistakes that cost some political points. As we're about to see, they set off something much, much deeper: a real psychological shift in the people of Ohio. A huge part of Donald Trump's power came from this emotional connection, right? Making people feel like he was on their side, fighting the elites for them. But the analysis here argues that when his own team started to look and act just like those very elites, well, that core connection just died from the contradiction. And this created this massive mental disconnect, what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. I mean, just imagine being told, "We're winning," while you're watching your farm go under. That clash between the official story and your everyday reality, it can kill loyalty way faster than any attack ad ever could, because the narrative just doesn't match what's happening. And this is a really, really important point. The people in Ohio didn't get angrier, they just got quieter. They went from loud anger, which, believe it or not, can be managed and redirected, to this silent withdrawal and recalculation. And for any entrenched power, that is way, way more dangerous. So this quiet shift marks a huge turning point in the analysis. It's the moment the population hit was called emotional saturation. Basically, it's the point where all the old tricks, the constant outrage, the calls for loyalty, they just stop working. When you reach that point of saturation, all the tools that used to work so well, creating conflict, a sense of urgency, rallying people against a common enemy, they not only stop working, they actually start to backfire. The constant emotional roller coaster that once fueled Donald Trump's base started to just make people tired and suspicious. So according to this analysis, people in Ohio stopped reacting to every little controversy or scandal. Instead, they started seeing the bigger picture. They started recognizing a predictable pattern, a system that just kept repeating itself. And what was that pattern? It was simple. Resources and wealth were being pulled upward, chaos and conflict like those trade wars were being pushed outward onto everybody else. And accountability? Well, that was nowhere to be found. Once people saw that pattern so clearly, the power of surprise was gone. And that brings us to the final phase described in this analysis, where things become irreversible. Because it's not about opposition anymore. See, opposing someone still admits they have power. This is about disbelief, which just erases it. I love this visual for it. Power doesn't just explode in some big, dramatic collapse. It thins out. It loses its density, stretching and stretching until it's fragile, almost see-through, so thin that light can pass right through it. And this slide breaks down that sequence perfectly. First, the voice is still there. It's still speaking. But then, it stops commanding action. And finally, it's all replaced by indifference. And indifference is so much more corrosive to power than hate. So what does this all boil down to? In Ohio, the very story, the central myths that held up this whole power structure, just fell apart. The ideas that defined Donald Trump's brand, strength, inevitability, unwavering loyalty, they were all punctured, all at the same time. So the big takeaway here is that this shift happened quietly. There was no big revolution, no dramatic showdown. According to the source, people in Ohio just mentally left the theater. And when your audience walks out, the show is over, whether you're done performing or not. So this whole analysis of Donald Trump's power in Ohio leaves us with this huge lingering question. And it's not just about Ohio or about one politician. It's for any system of power that's built on conflict and fear. What happens when the people just aren't afraid anymore?